some questions that when after I read the paper, some of the questions that came to my mind is that when we talk of pumping more money into the system, uh, where does the money come from? Now, let's for argument's sake take it that the government of India decides that in the next budget they will decide to put in this much money or sufficient money. But the question still remains, where does the money come from? Because Ela and I were discussing this afternoon that there really is not enough money to play around with. Second is that are we looking at a one time resolution of a problem that has been in the making for some time? Or are we looking at a resolution that will have a medium to long term impact and we can say tata goodbye to the problems that we face today? The link to this is the deep and I think very deep fault lines that run through our banking system and our banking regulatory system. To understand which and to deal with which, I think we also need to determine at which stage did the problems begin and where does RBI come into play? And should we depend entirely on RBI or should we have RBI is the regulatory authority? Should we then also look at a supervisory authority? Um, we all know that regulators, any regulator, does not want to admit mistakes because admission of mistake is also admission of inadequacy. So, how do we deal with that particular problem? And lastly, the ownership of public sector banks. Has the time come to reconsider the ownership of public sector banks? Why should government be owning them? If private sector banks are doing reasonably better than public sector banks, why should we persist with something that was done at a particular point of time? So maybe you want to make very quick comebacks and then we'll move to Ela for her comments.
Kanchan, thanks for those excellent comments. Let me start backwards, and I'm glad you raised the ones which I ran through. Ownership of the public sector banks. I think there is no doubt that we need to shrink the footprint of the public sector banks. I think there is for any number of reasons. The question is. How do we get there? I remember, discussing this with Mr. Jaitley and talking about this. And the fact is that the political mileage for this is across the spectrum, across the political spectrum is very weak. So my strong view would be that we need to think about shrinking the footprint of the public sector banks. But it's a question of how do you get there? How do you get the political will to do that? I think maybe one place, maybe this current situation we find ourselves in, would if we could convey the sense that so much taxpayer money has kind of bled in the form of the public sector banks, I think that would be one way forward. See, the problem, of course, is that making the case for public sector banks is not easy because I've encountered this when I was here, the pushback comes rightly. It's not as if private banks are perfect either. And of course, we know that, there have been lots of scandals also in private sector banks. But I think it's kind of a kind of relative thing. More private sector ownership with much better regulation is probably the way forward. And which leads to your next question about the regulation. Look, I think that all we can say is that if I start listing all the the scandals that have happened in the banking system, the conclusion is unambiguous that the regulator and the government together have not done a terrific job of supervising and regulating the bank system. But in terms of solutions, I honestly don't have an easy solution, because the IFC, the Financial Code, had a suggestion for a kind of independent financial sector regulator. I think that could be one possibility. But I think to think that having an independent regulator will be an easy or a quick fix is also, one should be careful of that, because we've had experiences of supervisors being independent and not working, being part of it and working. So I think it's a very mixed thing. I think for me, the important thing is, how do you create an institution, whether inside or outside the RBI? How do you create an institution with a culture that says, I'm paranoid and I'm going to be looking out for all that can go wrong in the system? That's what we need, an institution with that culture, whether it's within, outside, conflict of interest, I don't know. But I think we need that, because there've been so many lapses but I have I think Ela will be better judge than me to actually prescribe what it is that we need to do on this. Your question about where's the money coming from, I don't know what it was in response. So I think I'm echoing what you're saying by saying that is
About pumping more money into banks and into the financial system.
Yeah, so I kind of try to make it clear that I think we've already done a lot of recapitalization. That my own view is that we should stop, pouring more money in, and any further recapitalization has to be linked to some reform of the banking system, either privatization, shrinking banks, the PCA framework. So I'm not at all advocating more money being pumped in at given the current situation, because we've already done quite a bit.